Emmanuel's life had been the envy of many in Lagos. Living in a magnificent house within the gated estates of Victoria Island, driving a sleek black SUV, and wearing suits that spoke of affluence, Emmanuel was the picture of success. As a senior bank manager, his sharp mind and impeccable ethics earned him respect from both colleagues and clients. Everywhere he went, he was greeted with smiles and admiration. To his neighbors, he was a role model, to his friends, a dependable ally, and to his family, a symbol of stability. But life, unpredictable and cruel, dealt him a heavy blow one fateful Monday morning. As Emmanuel walked into the bank, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor, he noticed something odd. The usual warm greetings from his colleagues were replaced by hurried glances and murmured whispers. The air was heavy with tension, but Emmanuel dismissed it as workplace gossip. When he arrived at his office, a stark white envelope lay on his desk. His name was neatly typed on the front, and his heart skipped a beat as he picked it up. Slowly he opened it and began to read. Each word felt like a hammer blow to his chest. Dear Mr. Emmanuel, due to allegations of theft involving substantial sums of money, your employment with the bank is hereby terminated, effective immediately. An investigation is ongoing, and your accounts have been frozen pending further notice. The letter slipped from his trembling hands. Emmanuel's mind raced. Theft? How could this be? He had devoted years to the bank, working tirelessly to maintain its integrity. Who would accuse him of such a thing? Before he could process the shock, security personnel entered his office and politely but firmly asked him to leave the premises. Later that afternoon, Emmanuel stood helplessly outside his once grand mansion as uniformed officials sealed the property. His luxury SUV was towed away, his belongings confiscated. His wife, Linda, watched the scene unfold with a look of anger and disbelief. How could you let this happen? She spat, her voice dripping with contempt. What kind of man loses everything overnight? Her words pierced Emmanuel's heart. He felt an unbearable weight pressing down on him. The respect he had earned, the life he had built, the family he had provided for, all gone in an instant. By the end of the week, Emmanuel found himself in a cramped, run-down one-room apartment on the outskirts of the city. The walls were cracked and bare, and the air smelled of dampness. He shared this small space with his two young sons, David and Michael. Their innocent eyes, filled with confusion and sadness, were a constant reminder of his failure. Each day brought new challenges. His phone, once buzzing with calls from influential clients, now lay silent. Friends he had once helped turned their backs on him. Even his neighbors, who had once greeted him warmly, now whispered behind his back. Emmanuel felt trapped in a nightmare with no escape. As the days turned into weeks, Emmanuel sat on the edge of his worn mattress, staring at the peeling paint on the walls. The memories of his former life haunted him. He had been a respected man, a provider, a protector. Now he was just another struggling face in a city that thrived on wealth and status. Emmanuel clutched his head in his hands and whispered a desperate prayer. God, why me? What did I do to deserve this? Help me find a way out of this darkness. The transition from a life of affluence to one of hardship was a bitter pill for Emmanuel to swallow. Each morning he would wake up to the cries of his sons, David and Michael, who didn't understand why their father could no longer provide the comforts they once took for granted. The empty cupboards in their one-room apartment were a constant reminder of how far they had fallen. Emmanuel's savings were frozen, and every attempt to find meaningful work was met with rejection. Desperation led Emmanuel to the bustling city market, a chaotic hub of traders and laborers. Here he decided to push wheelbarrows for hire. It was a job that required no skills, no interviews, and no questions about his past. With a rusty wheelbarrow borrowed from an old man who pitied his plight, Emmanuel joined the ranks of laborers who spent their days carrying heavy goods for little pay. As he moved through the crowded streets, calling out, "Wheelbarrow for hire," he felt the sting of humiliation. Women who once greeted him with respect now ignored him. Some even laughed as they recognized him. "Isn't that Emmanuel, the big man from the bank?" they whispered. The mocking tones cut deep, but Emmanuel kept pushing. He had no choice. The work was grueling. The weight of the loads often left his hands blistered and his back aching. Yet he persevered. On a good day, he earned just enough to buy bread and Gary for his sons. On bad days, they went to bed hungry. David and Michael often asked, "Daddy, when will we go back to our big house?" Emmanuel's heart broke each time, but he hid his tears, determined to shield his sons from the harsh reality of their situation. Despite the hardship, Emmanuel's spirit was not entirely crushed. He found moments of solace in the kindness of strangers. A market woman once handed him a plate of jollof rice, saying, "You work too hard, my brother. Eat something." It was these small acts of compassion that kept him going. At night, he would sit with his sons, telling them stories of hope and faith. "God has not forgotten us," he would say. "Better days are coming." At home, life was no less challenging for Emmanuel. His wife Linda had grown increasingly bitter with each passing day. She had married Emmanuel for the comfort and status he provided, but now, with his fall from grace, she viewed him with contempt. Linda's anger was relentless. She blamed him for their poverty, for the cramped apartment, and for every misfortune that had befallen them. Each morning, as Emmanuel prepared to head to the market, her sharp words cut through the air like a knife. "You are useless, Emmanuel. How can a man who once managed a bank now push a wheelbarrow like a common laborer? You've brought shame to this family," she shouted, her voice echoing through the small room. Emmanuel bore her insults in silence, his heart heavy with pain. He refused to argue, knowing that nothing he said could ease Linda's bitterness. His focus was on his sons, David and Michael, who often cowered in a corner, frightened by their mother's outbursts. Emmanuel shielded them as best as he could, comforting them with words of hope and love. But the breaking point came one fateful evening. Emmanuel returned home after a long day at the market, his body aching and his clothes drenched in sweat. As he pushed open the door, he was met with an eerie silence. His sons were huddled together on the mattress, their faces pale with fear. Linda was gone. Emmanuel's heart sank as he realized her belongings were missing. Confused and worried, he sat down beside his sons. "Where is your mother?" he asked gently. David, the older of the two, hesitated before answering. "She left with Uncle Victor," he whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. The words hit Emmanuel like a thunderbolt. Victor, his younger brother, had always been a source of tension. Though he had once supported Victor through school, their relationship had soured over the years. Victor's flashy lifestyle and careless attitude often clashed with Emmanuel's values. Now, to hear that Victor had taken Linda, his wife, was a betrayal Emmanuel couldn't fathom. The pain of her departure was magnified by the way she left. She hadn't just abandoned him, she had walked out on her own children, leaving them behind without a second thought. Emmanuel held his sons close, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'll never leave you. I promise." That night, Emmanuel lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound. He had lost his job, his home, his dignity, and now his wife. Yet, as the first rays of dawn broke through the window, Emmanuel made a silent vow. He would not let this defeat him. For the sake of his sons, he would find a way to rebuild their lives. Days turned into weeks and Linda never returned. Emmanuel was now solely responsible for his two young boys, David and Michael. His days were long and grueling, and his nights were filled with worry. His small earnings from pushing a wheelbarrow were hardly enough to cover food, let alone other expenses. The boys had grown quieter, their innocent questions about their mother replaced by the sad reality that she wasn't coming back. The first major blow came when David and Michael were sent home from school. The principal, though sympathetic, could no longer allow them to stay without paying the outstanding fees. Emmanuel stood in the school's dusty compound, holding their small hands, trying to hide the shame burning in his chest. "I'll find the money," he promised, his voice firm despite the hopelessness he felt. At home, the situation worsened. The landlord, a stern man with little patience, came knocking. "Mr. Emmanuel," he began, his tone sharp, "you're 3 months behind on rent. If you don't pay by the end of this week, you'll have to leave." Emmanuel pleaded for more time, but the landlord's expression remained cold. "No money, no house," he said before walking away. Desperation pushed Emmanuel to do what he had sworn never to do. He decided to seek help from his brother Victor. Though Victor's betrayal still stung, Emmanuel hoped that he would at least help for the sake of the children. One evening he gathered his courage and walked to Victor's lavish mansion. The sight of the grand gates and the expensive cars parked outside reminded Emmanuel of what he had lost. Victor greeted him with a smug smile. Well, if it isn't my big brother," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What brings you here, Emmanuel? Come to ask for handouts?" Emmanuel swallowed his pride. "Victor, I need your help. The boys have been sent home from school and the landlord is threatening to evict us. Please, for the sake of the children, help us." Victor laughed, a cruel sound that echoed through the grand hall. "You always thought you were better than me, didn't you? Now look at you begging for my help." Linda appeared from one of the rooms, dressed in expensive clothes and jewelry. Her expression was cold as she looked at Emmanuel. "Why are you still here?" she sneered. "You're a failure, Emmanuel. Leave us alone." Victor added, "I'm not a charity, Emmanuel. You're on your own." Emmanuel's heart broke as he walked away from the house. He felt the weight of rejection and betrayal, but as he looked at the faces of his sons, he knew he couldn't give up. "We will survive," he whispered, holding their hands tightly. Victor's laughter echoed in Emmanuel's mind as he walked back to the small apartment he called home. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the ache in his heart grew stronger. His sons, David and Michael, met him at the door, their small faces lighting up with hope. But Emmanuel couldn't bring himself to tell them what had happened. Instead, he hugged them tightly, drawing strength from their innocence. The next morning, Emmanuel resolved to find another way. He visited friends and former colleagues, hoping someone might lend him enough to settle the immediate debts. One after another they turned him down, some with pity, others with indifference. "Emmanuel, times are hard for everyone," one of them said, avoiding his gaze. With no options left, Emmanuel poured all his energy into his wheelbarrow work. He arrived at the market earlier than usual and stayed until the last traders packed up for the day. His hands grew calloused, his back ached, but he pushed through the pain, determined to save every naira he earned. Yet even with the extra effort, the money was never enough. As the week came to an end, the landlord returned, this time with two men who stood like silent enforcers. "Mr. Emmanuel," he said sternly, "I gave you enough time. You and your boys need to leave by tomorrow morning." Emmanuel pleaded, his voice cracking. "Please give me just a little more time. I'm doing all I can." But the landlord shook his head. "Business is business," he replied coldly. That night, Emmanuel stayed awake, staring at his sleeping sons. He felt like a failure, unable to provide even the most basic necessities for them. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered a prayer. "God, I need your help. I've tried everything, but I'm losing hope. Please don't let my boys suffer because of me." Morning came too soon, and Emmanuel packed what little they owned into a tattered bag. As they stepped out of the apartment, he avoided the landlord's gaze. Homeless and with nowhere to turn, he decided to head to the market, hoping to find shelter among the traders he had come to know. One trader, a woman named Mama Beezy, noticed Emmanuel's plight. "My son, what happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Emmanuel hesitated but eventually shared his story. Mama Beezy shook her head in sympathy. "You can't stay on the streets with these children. Come, I have a small storage space behind my shop. It's not much, but it's better than nothing." Grateful beyond words, Emmanuel and his sons moved into the tiny storage room. It was cramped and dusty, but it gave them a roof over their heads. That night, as they lay on the hard floor, Emmanuel held his sons close and whispered, "We'll get through this. I promise." Days turned into weeks, and Emmanuel continued working tirelessly. The market became his lifeline and the traders his community. Though life was harsh, Emmanuel's faith never wavered. He believed that one day things would change for the better. One quiet afternoon in the market, as Emmanuel rested beside his wheelbarrow, he overheard two traders engaged in a heated discussion. Their voices were low, but the excitement in their tones was unmistakable. "Have you seen Victor's new mansion?" one of them asked, her eyes widening as she spoke. "The place is like a palace. And those cars parked outside, they're the latest models? The second trader nodded eagerly. I heard he bought it all in just a few months. People are saying his money didn't come from clean hands. You know what they say about such sudden wealth? Emmanuel froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't spoken to Victor since the humiliating encounter at his mansion, but hearing his brother's name stirred a mix of emotions, anger, curiosity, and an aching sense of betrayal. He leaned closer, pretending to adjust his wheelbarrow to catch more of their conversation. They say he's into something dark, the first trader whispered, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. How else can someone go from struggling to living like a king overnight? Emmanuel's mind raced as he processed their words. He thought back to the Victor he once knew, the younger brother he had supported through school, the one who had always envied his success. How had Victor, a man who once relied on his help, risen to such heights so quickly? That evening, as Emmanuel pushed his wheelbarrow home, their words echoed in his mind. Could there be truth to the rumors? Could Victor's newfound wealth have come at a cost far greater than money? Emmanuel shook his head, trying to dismiss the thoughts, but a nagging feeling remained. At the small storage room they now called home, David and Michael greeted him with tired smiles. "Daddy, you look worried," David said. Emmanuel couldn't shake the words he had overheard in the market about Victor's sudden wealth. The whispers of dark means and sacrifices haunted him as he went about his daily struggles. The Victor he had known was a carefree younger brother who barely passed through school. How had he become the man with luxury cars and a mansion in just a few months? These questions lingered in Emmanuel's mind until they became unbearable. One evening, after a long day at the market, Emmanuel sat outside the small storage room he now called home. The cool breeze did little to soothe the turmoil inside him. His sons were asleep, their soft breaths the only sounds breaking the silence. Emmanuel stared at the stars, seeking answers. "God," he whispered, "if Victor's wealth is tied to evil, show me the truth." The following day, Emmanuel decided to confront Victor directly. It wasn't an easy decision. The humiliation he had endured during his last visit still stung. But he needed to know the truth, not just for his own peace of mind but for the safety of his sons. That evening he left the market and walked the long road to Victor's mansion. The opulence of Victor's home was even more glaring under the golden glow of streetlights. Emmanuel stood at the grand gates, gathering his courage before pressing the doorbell. A security guard approached, eyeing him suspiciously. "What do you want?" the guard asked. "I need to see Victor," Emmanuel replied firmly. The guard hesitated but eventually let him in, muttering under his breath about unexpected visitors. Victor greeted Emmanuel with the same smug smile that had taunted him before. "Back so soon?" Victor said, leaning against a marble pillar. "What brings you this time, big brother?" "I came for the truth," Emmanuel said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. "People are talking about how quickly you've risen. They say your wealth isn't natural. What did you do, Victor?" Victor's smile faded, replaced by a dark expression Emmanuel had never seen before. He motioned for Emmanuel to follow him into his expansive living room.
Join us in part 2 of The Wheelbarrow Man They Mocked, a billionaire's secret life on this channel.